This movie was destined to be included in YouTube video essays about forgettable movies of the 2010s. Like, that's it. I can already see the thumbnail. A reviewer type person going like this, and in the background is this poster, and the title is something like, "We need to talk about this forgotten gem." But we don't. We really don't. No one needs to. No one on the internet is like, "I wish we had more Hop discourse."
Oh, if only you knew, John's videos. If only you knew. Illumination. What can I say about it? An animation company that started off strong with its first movie, Despicable Me, and then immediately fell into a nosedive of mediocrity and never got back up for several years. It does seem like its reputation is starting to get better following the release of the Mario movie, but before that, its lineup has been generally mediocre. As of right now, it only has a lineup of about 14 movies, and a majority of them have had mixed to pretty negative receptions, save for Despicable Me 1, which most people do seem to still like, and the Mario Bros. Movie, which was actually a pretty good movie, and is now the third highest grossing animated movie of all time as I'm writing this, hot damn. And I won't deny the amount of talented actors, animators, etc. that put their work into these movies. I've got a lot of respect for them. I'm talking about the company as a whole. The company that's mainly known for putting out bland, mediocre kids movies that, while pretty harmless in the long run, can range from decently forgettable to downright unbearable. The company whose movies have been memed to hell and back, where sometimes the memes are more entertaining than the actual movies themselves. You know, that company. But in that 14 movie lineup, there seems to be one oddball movie that most people either don't talk about that much or just look at with utter scorn. The movie that's so different from the rest of the lineup that it's usually brushed over by many a moviegoer. The crown jewel of Illumination's mediocrity, often being cited as the worst Illumination movie of all time. The movie known as... Hop? Wait, really? I mean, it's not the best Illumination film by any means. It's got its flaws to it, and I get people not liking it. But the worst one? God, this is starting to sound like my Nim 2 video all over again. I mean, this is Illumination we're talking about. I can think of a few worse ones right off the bat. Grinch, Minions, Lorax, Minions, Secret Life of Pets 2, Minions, Despicable Me 3, Minions, you get the point. Minions, I don't really get labeling this film as worse than all those ones I just mentioned. Hell, even when it comes to animated movies, or even just movies in general, Hop doesn't even come close to being the worst. Believe me, I've seen worse. Now, before we get into everything, I want to address a question that may or may not be going through your mind when watching this. Did I make this video as a response to Schaeferless putting this as the worst movie on his Illumination ranking? Well...
the absolute bottom of the barrel, worst of the worst Illumination movie by a massive landslide. Your brain starts to collapse in on itself into a fucking black hole of embarrassment that you feel for everyone involved. I knew remember when the sister thought he was a suspect when the most insane freaking thing about all of this is the fact that at the end, with absolutely zero hesitation, even with this carbon, DB's dad appoints James Marsden to the employees all first him just how bad. What's the difference, huh? What's the difference, motherfucker? But yeah, James Marsden gets to be co-Easter Bunny just because he's really wanted it and he really loves the Easter Bunny. But then, I fucking despise everything about it, and I sincerely hope people don't actually watch it every time Easter rolls around.
Yeah. Kinda. Little bit. Like, I'm sorry, I really do like and respect Schaeferless. I have nothing against him personally, and in fact, he's one of my biggest inspirations when it comes to content creation. I do not hold it against him personally just for having a different movie opinion. But his analysis of Hop and his Illumination ranking bothers me to no end. The rest of the video is fine, and I did agree with him on most parts regarding the other movies, but when it came to Hop, I just found myself mentally arguing against pretty much every criticism he made towards it.
That's very good. In a crude, primitive, offensive to me personally kind of way.
There was so much what I wanted to say and dispute about it, and the best way for me to do that is to do what others have done with his Disney ranking and make a video essay arguing against Shape's points. I figure now will be a good time for me to lay out the good that this film does, and why I personally feel it's underlooked. This is why Hop 2011 is not the worst Illumination movie. Roll it. first, let's take a look at the main stars of the show, the son of the Easter Bunny, E.B., and the pre-Sonic movie James Marsden character, Fred O'Hare. Both of these characters share a critical part in the story and have similar themes, both of which serve the message of the film and the growth of the characters themselves. Let's first look at E.B. After the opening voiceover with Fred, the film opens with a young E.B. on top of an Easter Island moai, drumming his heart out with a pair of bongos. His father takes him on a tour of the Easter factory, where he explains to E.B. the importance of being the Easter Bunny and how he'll be taking on the role someday. Cut to a few years later, as E.B. is seen rocking out with his drum set. His father walks in to try to convince E.B. to go out there and accept his new spot as the Easter Bunny, but E.B. states that he doesn't want to, as he already has a passion of being a drummer. Right from the beginning, the film establishes E.B. as excitable about the things he's passionate about, which in this case happens to be drumming. It's first set up with his bongos at the beginning, and follows over to his teenage years with his fully fledged drum set. Not only does this establish the musical abilities E.B. uses throughout the film, and is what kicks off the plot in having conflicts of interest with his father, and is further paid off in the climax of the film, but it also reflects E.B.'s personality as well. E.B. is very extroverted and eager to follow his passions, often quick on his feet and full of energy. He's adventurous and outgoing, so having him be passionate about drumming reflects that, as it allows him to hone that extroverted energy into something that requires a lot of passion and quick thinking. This was a deliberate choice too. The filmmakers wanted E.B. to have an instrument that reflected his personality, which is something that most musicians do in real life when picking out an instrument. Having the main character follow a passion that's not only important to the plot, but also reflects the character itself, is an excellent way to flesh them out as a person. Well, rabbit, and make them have a unique personality trait. And this may be a personal thing, but I think having these traits go to a bunny character works as well, not just because bunnies fit the Easter motif and seeing a bunny play drums makes for a cute visual, but also having this energetic personality fits with a generally energetic animal. I also want to take a moment to compliment E.B.'s design as well. For all the flaws a majority of Illumination films might have, animation quality was never really one of them, even in their worst films except for Minions, that one sucked. And Hop is no exception. For one, the CGI for E.B. has aged surprisingly well. And that's impressive on its own, given that it was made in 2011, the same year that the live-action Smurfs movie came out. I don't think I need to explain how well that one aged. It's realistic enough that it blends into the human world naturally and doesn't look that out of place, but it's also cartoony enough to give E.B., and by extension the rest of the bunnies, a cute and appealing design. He's lively and expressive in both his movements and facial expressions, yet also has just enough realism for it to look like an actual rabbit while also not dipping into Uncanny Valley. It especially shines in the scenes whenever E.B.'s drumming. The movements and timing with the instruments are spot on, and incredibly well animated. Again, this was intentional. During the making of the movie, the filmmakers brought an actual drummer onto the set and did their best to have E.B. mirror his movements so it would be as accurate as they could get it to be. There are a couple minor slip-ups, like when E.B. gets picked up and it's plainly obvious the actors are grabbing at nothing, but overall I'd say it's aged remarkably well. Contrast this to something like Minions 2015, where all the supposed main characters seem to have the blandest, most unimaginative character designs possible. That, or delving into overplayed British stereotypes. The only characters that seem to stand out in that film are the titular minions themselves, and even then it doesn't really work, since even they are indistinguishable from the swarm of other minions in both this film and the Despicable Me films. It's impossible to get invested in a main character when their design is so bland and safe it just turns into visual mush. Though trust me, it's the least of that movie's problems. Anyways, going back to E.B.'s character, E.B. has a set character arc throughout the film that helps serve both himself and the character of Fred, who we'll get to later on, and it has a pretty natural progression. Admittedly, E.B. does have some jerkish tendencies, starting from when he first meets Fred in his house, but they're small moments at best and are only really there to serve as a catalyst for his and Fred's arcs in the story. I've heard people complain about these scenes in particular, though, and how it makes E.B. unlikable. And I feel like a lot of them are forgetting that these mostly take place in the beginning of the story and not the entire film. For instance, there is one part where E.B. fakes being hurt and manipulates Fred into letting him stay in the house, only to later trash the upstairs bedroom. Oh no! Anyways, check out Over the Hedge, a film where the main character emotionally manipulates an entire family of foragers with a fake sob story about his parents getting killed with a weed hacker, only to use that family throughout a majority of the film to steal food from the humans with the so-called promise of helping them survive without telling them of his true intentions. And when he does let slip, he leaves them all behind for them to get captured, to which they explicitly would have been killed if he didn't have a change of heart. What's a double standards? Alright, I may have been a little mean with that. I do genuinely love Over the Hedge, and it is a better film overall than Hop. But the main reason I bring it up is to point out how odd a lot of the main criticisms toward this movie are, because painting the main character as purely unlikable for doing jerkish things, despite them being justified with either the type of character they are or the situation they're in, honestly rubs me the wrong way. Hell, most of the stuff that EB does isn't even out of ill intent. He was on the run the whole time. Like when Fred tells EB to stay in the car at the job interview or in the bag during his sister's play, EB does just that, and it's only when he finds out that he's being tracked down does he try to take off and hide. Had he not been being chased the whole time, which was outside of EB's control, most of the antics more than likely would not have happened. Having the main character have jerkish tendencies near the start, only to grow out of them later on in the movie, isn't to detract from the main character itself, it's to serve their arc throughout the film and have them grow as a person when they bond more with the person they spend the most time with. In EB's case, his arc stems from learning more of his responsibilities as the Easter Bunny and growing out of him being an immature teenager by learning responsibilities for his own actions. Obviously, we as the audience aren't meant to condone EB's actions in the beginning, but EB is a teenager. Teenagers do immature things. It's quite literally the entire point of his arc, and is further paid off as he grows and bonds more with Fred. But before I fully explain what I mean by that, I want to get to Fred's character first. Fred O'Hare, played by James Marsden, is the secondary protagonist of the movie and gets about as much focus as EB does. He accompanies EB throughout most of the movie, has his own storyline and motivations, and is especially a key part in the film's third act when he trains for and eventually becomes the first human Easter Bunny. Fred is shown at the start of the movie as a young kid, where he ends up spotting the Easter Bunny one night but doesn't get out in time to fully see him. Cut to 20 years later, where we see him as a fully grown adult with his family, who are sick of him slacking off and refusing job interviews, and promptly kick him out of the house so he can get a job of his own. His sister Sam offers him a place to stay at her boss's house, since the boss is currently off on vacation. On the way, Fred quite literally runs into EB, the two meet up in the house, and the rest is history. Now, generally when you're writing two main protagonists that team up with each other, you have to have some sort of connection or chemistry between the characters in order to make them work. They don't necessarily have to be too similar to each other, but as long as there's a clear match between the two, then it makes sense. Take Mike and Sully from Monsters Inc. for example. They have different personalities from each other, with Mike being the snarky, sarcastic one and Sully being more laid back, but the two have an excellent dynamic with each other due to them having similar goals and motivations. Their pre-established friendship does play a big part in it as well, but it's when Mike and Sully have to deal with Boo that the two have a clear goal, and therefore have bigger opportunities to interact with and bounce off each other. It's what a good character dynamic should do. Luckily for Hop, it passes this test with flying colors. Even before the two cross paths, there's a clear similarity between Fred and EB's storylines and motivations. Both of them generally start off as slackers whose parents want them to be more than what they currently are and take responsibility for themselves. Mr. Bunny wants EB to be the Easter Bunny, and Fred's parents want him to just simply get a respectable job. Both of them are incredibly reluctant to do so, and both of them leave their homes to set out to find their purpose, whether they want to or not. Having a similar setup between the two characters before they meet, while also making them distinct from each other, is brilliant. It already sets up the relationship for the two and gives them a clear connection, but it also keeps their storylines separate in the beginning, and therefore makes both of them easy to follow. And it only grows from there when Fred and EB eventually do meet up with each other. They'd start off as you expect a typical movie duo to first meet up, with the two being at odds with each other and Fred trying to ditch EB. But it's the moment when EB reveals that he's the Easter Bunny that starts the connecting spark between the two. It ties back to that moment in the beginning of Fred as a kid when he saw the Easter Bunny in his yard, basically the Easter equivalent to seeing Santa Claus in your living room on Christmas Eve. From that point on, the two start to develop a mutual connection with each other, with EB wanting to pursue his dream of being a famous drummer, and eventually Fred wanting to be the next Easter Bunny. Both of them help each other in their respective goals, with Fred helping EB stay hidden and get to the Hoff-Nosed talent auditions, and EB training Fred in the ways of being the Easter Bunny. The two bounce off of each other not only for how they have a similar cynical sense of humor, but also how they bond over both their experiences with their respective families, and how they both feel shunned from their parents, not to mention their shared connection to Easter. The movie gives our main characters a clear common ground, and it capitalizes on it by having them help each other in achieving their goals and their bond growing stronger as the film progresses. It's especially shown after EB nails his role in the talent audition and in Fred's training montage, since it's where we see Fred and EB bonding the most and having genuine friendship with each other. And even with their core goals aside, EB and Fred have a good friendship chemistry with each other. EB's more upbeat and outgoing personality contrasts with Fred's drier sarcasm, which is usually a staple of these types of live-action/animation hybrid films. Yet it works because it's still satisfying to see these two unlikely friends grow closer, treating each other with more fondness and having them work more naturally with each other, where by the end they're happy to work as a team and it feels like there'll be more adventures with each other. It makes sense for the main characters, it accomplishes the main goals of the plot, and serves as a catalyst for their development. That's how you use a duo to have a good character growth. And speaking of character growth, there's no bigger example of this in the film than EB himself. I've already gone over how EB had some jerkish tendencies in the beginning, mostly from him being a moody teenager, and also from him being on the run, but that is not inherently a bad thing. Having the main character's flaws be shown at the beginning is partly what makes the character arc work, since it's meant to serve as a catalyst for what they can improve on as the film progresses. For EB, his catalyst is owning up to his responsibilities, both as being the Easter Bunny and being there for his friends and family. After the setup at the beginning and all the scenes of EB being immature, we get our first sense of growth from EB during the scene after he nails his audition for the Hoff's talent show. For the first time, EB starts to be honest with himself when he confesses to Fred that he ran away from his responsibilities as the Easter Bunny, opening up to Fred and having them both realize just how similar they are. And in a single dialogue exchange, we also get a clearer glimpse of why EB felt the need to do what he did.
Who wouldn't want to be the Easter Bunny? That's like the greatest job ever.
Yeah, you think so, but it's what my dad wants, not me. He expects so much. What's left for me to do but let him down?
This not only adds a new layer to EB's motivations and pushes him further down the path of wanting to grow as a character, but it's also somewhat relatable. EB is aware of how much his father wants him to take on the role of the Easter Bunny, but he has different passions that his father dismisses him for. He's been raised quite literally all his life to be built up in the Easter Bunny role, but he feels like he's built for other things. And this is even touched upon at the beginning when EB's father talks to him about it.
Listen, you want me to be this, but maybe I'm not this. Just maybe I'm this.
A sock?
Yeah, that's right. I might be a metaphorical sock. I might not be a good enough egg, but I might be the best sock ever. I might not cut it delivering Easter baskets, but I might be great at something else.
He believes that he's destined for more than what his father wants him to be, and his passion for drumming fuels that, so when he's told he has to be something else, it creates a huge conflict. He's been conditioned all his life to prepare for being the Easter Bunny and nothing else, to the point where he mentions that there was a period of time where the sight of a colored egg made him want to vomit. EB knows that being the Easter Bunny is a big responsibility, but his heart isn't in it, at least not at the start. That alone is relatable for anyone who wants to follow a passion of theirs, but feel dragged into doing something else simply because it's their responsibility, one that they have to be a part of. I have unrealized passions of my own, I'm sure you do as well. Now, while EB running away is nowhere near the best solution for it, which the movie explicitly makes clear with its message as it goes on, it is a realistic conflict. These scenes show that EB feels like he would be letting his father down if he took a responsibility he didn't have the heart for. The scenes that follow it grow upon this further, most notably when Fred confesses to EB that he wants to be the Easter Bunny, and the training montage that follows. Initially, EB thinks this idea is ridiculous, since, again, he's been literally trained all his life to believe otherwise, but comes around to it when he realizes how serious Fred is about it, and even goes so far as to set up an entire obstacle course for Fred to train in. This highlights how much closer EB and Fred have bonded with working together as friends, and as we find out later, setting up their teamwork for them to be co-Easter Bunnies. But what it also does is further EB's arc of learning his responsibility, since he's making the effort to support his friend the same way that Fred did with helping EB on the path to fame. He learns to think about someone other than himself and makes a genuine effort to help someone he cares about. And finally, we get to the final bit of EB's arc, which admittedly starts with a bit of a setback. After the montage, EB is sleeping on the couch when he's woken up by the sound of glass shattering, which of course turns out to be the pink berets breaking into the house, the same ones who have been chasing him throughout the entire movie and who he's repeatedly been trying to avoid, since if they catch him, they'll bring him back to Easter Island. Panicking, EB tries to throw them off by quickly faking his death via a plaid shirt and a butterball turkey in a cooking pot before escaping right as the Hoff's Got Talent bus shows up. On the one hand, yeah, this is a really dick move, especially since it unintentionally frames Fred and causes the pink berets to knock him unconscious. But, on the other hand, 1. EB was on panic mode and acted completely rashly. He acted on his instincts of wanting to throw off the pink berets without realizing the consequences of it until it was too late. Reminder that he's been on the run from them the entire movie and is actually fearful of them. It's expected that he would act this rashly when panicked while not thinking about what it would do, especially since, again, he is a teenager. And 2, he does realize this pretty quickly afterwards. Right after he gets onto the bus, EB has a moment of realization about what this would mean to Fred, but hand waves it and says,
"Oh, he'll be alright."
Now, much like with the majority of complaints about this film, I feel like this line in particular is taken the wrong way. Some would point to it as yet another example of how unlikable EB is, how he only cares for himself without thinking of his own consequences. That's totally what this line is about, right? Cut to his next scene.
You are the world's best rabbit drummer. You are a superstar. You are a jerk for abandoning Fred. Hey, I don't need that kind of voice in my head. Yeah, well, you should have thought of that before you abandoned Fred. Look, you better tell me something positive about me. I can't. You abandoned Fred.
He realizes on his own how much of a jerk he's been. And not only that, but it's not out of concern for himself. It's about Fred, the one person he was really able to connect with on a personal level besides his father. Even on his initial realization, his first thought isn't about himself. It's about Fred. Him trying to hand wave it off wasn't out of genuine dismissal, it was him trying to convince himself. He knows he's on the cusp of fame, the goal he had initially strived for at the start of his journey, and in just a few moments he will have achieved everything he thought he wanted to get. Yet, even in those few moments, no matter how much he tries to convince himself otherwise, he knows he abandoned his friend, and his conscience is literally berating him for it. This isn't the same EB that we've seen at the beginning, where he would run away from his home or push Fred into letting him do what he wants. This is an EB that's grown from who he was before, and now actually considers the weight of his actions and thinks of people other than himself. His bonding with Fred and them both helping each other has caused EB to learn to grow out of his immaturity, becoming a better person and having a greater sense of consciousness and concern for his responsibilities and his friends' well-beings. When EB takes a moment to talk with Hasselhoff, the person who he really got to show his drumming talent to, and who would make EB famous if he kept going, EB expresses how he feels guilty and selfish over ditching Fred the way he did. He's concerned between achieving his lifelong dream of being a famous drummer and going back for the person he cares about, since if he walks out now, he's essentially giving up all the fame and fortune he's wanted and worked to get.
I'm starting to realise I might be a really selfish rabbit. Look, I love drumming, but when my friend needed me most, I left him in a house full of highly trained ninja bunnies. I know that if I left right now, I'd be giving up fame, and Fred could be in real trouble.
And what decision does EB make when he talks to Hasselhoff about it? He goes after Fred. He willingly gives up the fame he's worked for to go back to Fred and save him from the trouble he feels he's in. He was conflicted by the thing he worked for and the thing he cared for. Yet all it takes for EB to ultimately make his decision is 3 words.
Go to him.
That is all the convincing EB needs. And good thing too. It's how he's able to find out Fred's been taken back to Easter Island, and how he ultimately finds out about and ends up thwarting Carlos's evil plans, saving both his father and Fred from certain death in the process. If it weren't for EB realizing his own mistakes and going back to fix things, the entire final climax of the film would not have happened. Having EB be convinced to go back to protect his friend and fix what needs to be done right while simultaneously throwing away his original goal is a perfect way to cap off his arc, since it serves as the moment where EB realizes where his priorities actually lie and becomes a defining moment for him as a character. Going back to my Over the Hedge example, in that film, the main character RJ goes through a similar situation, and arguably through much worse circumstances. RJ had an original goal from the beginning, which was to collect food for a homicidal bear in less than a week. So to do so, he enlists the help of a family of foragers by putting on a mask of helping the starving group get more food, essentially manipulating and guilt-tripping them with a fake sad backstory. He does end up getting the food he needs one way or another, but ends up becoming attached to the family over time and starts to genuinely bond with them. So when his mask slips and he ends up revealing his ulterior plans, both sides are left broken. The family is captured and taken to be put down as inhumanely as possible, leaving RJ with nothing left but to bring the food wagon to Vincent, like he promised at the beginning of the film. However, when he takes a moment to reflect on what he's done and what truly matters to him, he has a change of heart and dashes off to save his friends, destroying the food, again, and enraging Vincent in the process. But at this point, RJ doesn't care. He's found where his cares and priorities really lie, and he's going to make the effort to redeem himself and save the ones he truly loves. In both these cases, the main character has an ulterior goal that he wants to achieve in a short amount of time, and starts off by manipulating someone that he knows can help, but ends up genuinely bonding with them and having more of an actual connection with them than they originally anticipated. So when that friend or friends gets into serious danger due to something that the main character did, they have a change of heart and toss out their original goal in order to save them. Unlike EB, RJ's case was a lot more extreme and involved multiple people instead of just one, and his actions throughout the film were arguably much worse and much more manipulative than EB was. Yet his redemption still works because you feel the connection that RJ has with the other foragers, and he makes a genuine effort to save and protect the ones he cares about. That's essentially the same that goes on with EB's arc in Hop, albeit on a much smaller scale. EB has grown from the person he was at the beginning, turning from the selfish, immature rabbit into one that cares for his friends and actually considers the responsibility and impact of his actions. And in the end, it all pays off. Not only does he fulfill his role as the Easter Bunny, or rather co-Easter Bunny, he's happy to accept it, because he knows he's ready. He's accepting his responsibilities and no longer feels like he's letting anyone down for them. And he has a greater appreciation for his friends and family on top of that. It's consistent with the plot, comes around full circle, and directly affects the characters in a positive way, both the main character and the people around him. That is everything a good character arc should be. Alright, I think I've gone into enough depth as to why I find EB to be a likable character, and why I feel his characterization ultimately works in Hop's story. But even with EB and Fred aside, that's just two characters. How about the rest? Since we've already taken a look at the two main characters, why not next take a look at the villain of the film as well? The big baddie of the movie, and one that ultimately serves as the final goal for EB to face against Carlos. His role in the story is that he serves as the second in command for the Easter Bunny, but grows tired of the role, so he secretly plans to overthrow Mr. Bunny and take full control of Easter Island and the holiday along with it. He enlists the help of all the other Easter chicks, including his assistant Phil, and launches a coup d'etat against Mr. Bunny, intending to become the new ruler of Easter. Now, before we get into the real nitty-gritty of Carlos's character, I want to address the major elephant in the room first. The criticism of Carlos having racist implications because he has a Hispanic accent.
By the way, the bunnies have British accents and Carlos has a Hispanic accent.
Boy, if you don't get—
Alright, so out of all the criticisms toward this film, to me this one simultaneously makes the most sense and also the least sense. Conceptually, I agree it is kind of an iffy choice for the film to make, and I get why people will be upset about it. I will admit this film has a few aspects that didn't age all that well in hindsight, such as this line.
All great artists suffer before they become famous. That lady wrote Harry Potter in a ditch.
Oh no!
But at the same time, when you think about it on more than a surface level, the argument kind of falls apart. I know I'm most likely walking into treacherous waters here, so I'll try to choose my words carefully. The portrayal of Carlos as a character, accent aside, isn't stereotypical in any way. There's no offensive stereotyping towards Hispanic people in the way Carlos acts or behaves throughout the film. He just happens to have a Hispanic accent. You could pretty much switch his voice out with any other accent and he wouldn't act all that different. Not to mention, Carlos is literally the only chick in the film to have a Hispanic accent. His assistant Phil speaks as well and he doesn't have an accent at all. Even if we were to take the bunny's treatment of Carlos into consideration, neither Mr. Bunny nor EB were actively being hostile towards Carlos before the big reveal. EB doesn't interact with him at all aside from the opening scene of him as a kid, so that's out. And as for Mr. Bunny, he trusts Carlos as his advisor and regularly talks with him about whatever's going on. And it's clear that Mr. Bunny holds Carlos in a high regard. The only time we get anything close to him being hostile to Carlos is him laughing at the idea of a chick delivering Easter. And even then, that was clearly more out of him being uptight about tradition rather than any animosity towards either Carlos or chicks in general. The movie before this point already established Mr. Bunny to be a stickler for a tradition that's been going on for thousands of years, as shown in the beginning scene of EB trying to get out of being the Easter Bunny.
Now listen to me. 4,000 2,000 years of tradition doesn't end just because one selfish bunny doesn't feel like doing it.
He's shown to be uptight about the very holiday he stands for, and as such, doesn't take kindly to his son EB trying to deviate from it by skipping out on the role. It's only when Mr. Bunny sees Fred and knows how much he means to EB and Easter as a whole, does he let go of his preconceived beliefs. The movie itself treats the over-reliance of tradition as a bad thing, which includes Mr. Bunny's notion that only a bunny can deliver Easter. This is treated as a bad thing in universe. Again, I get why people will be upset about it, and I agree it could have been handled a lot better. But claiming it to be this racist allegory purely because of Carlos having a Hispanic accent ultimately doesn't make sense, especially when it is very much not that way in the story at all. Alright, what was I talking about before? Oh yeah, Carlos as a character. When you want to introduce a villain into your film, there are a million different ways you can go about doing so. You can have him be cartoonishly evil from the beginning, you can have him start off as innocent but get more corrupted as the film progresses, you can go the Disney route and set him up as innocent but have him be revealed near the end to be evil all along, even if it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, etc, etc. There are a lot of different setups to choose from, and what the film chooses to do in setting up Carlos is actually done in a clever way, at least in my opinion. The movie does a good job at setting up Carlos as an effective villain even before the big reveal. It establishes his personality from the beginning as resentful towards EB and Mr. Bunny, with how he angrily shouts at young EB for eating a few of the peeps, or how he grumbles at them when they're out of sight. Along with that, it also sets up his relationship with his assistant Phil, a younger chick with a massive love for dancing. I'll get to more on him later. After the opening, the next few times we see Carlos is after EB has already run away and Mr. Bunny is moping about his last argument with him, and this is where we start to see more of Carlos's motives and personality. It's clear that Carlos resents his position as second in command and wants to take over Mr. Bunny's role and the holiday itself, but what pushes Carlos into villain territory is his manipulation. Despite Mr. Bunny's clear sadness at having lost his son, Carlos shows zero concern for it and barely makes any attempt to hide his excitement. He deliberately misinterprets Mr. Bunny asking about his son as if he's talking about the literal son, spelled with a U, skips and hops for joy right next to Mr. Bunny when they're talking about EB's disappearance, and tries to make multiple attempts to use Mr. Bunny's sadness and feigned sympathy to manipulate and gaslight him into forgetting about his son and handing the job over to Carlos instead.
And at the height of our busiest time, it's almost unforgivable. Please, senor, don't be too rash. It's way too early to disown him. But I wasn't going to... Wait a minute, are you hopping? Wouldn't it be wise to pass the mantle to, I don't know, somebody else? You should clear this out, make a new den or a clubhouse, or like a man cave. The son is very difficult to replace. Difficult, but not impossible.
In his first few scenes, Carlos displays traits of resentment and bitterness towards the bunnies, yet hides them under a fake persona of being compassionate, which he tries to use to his advantage when talking to Mr. Bunny. He presents himself as sympathetic to Mr. Bunny losing his son, when really it's clear he doesn't give a rat's ass about EB, and all he wants is to take over the job. He's arrogant and conniving, and believes himself to be better than everyone else, with how he clearly despises the bunnies and constantly barks orders at Phil. His deceptiveness and superiority complex is displayed clearly enough for the audience to observe and understand, which is what makes him an effective antagonist even before the third act of the film. And is expanded upon further with his next few scenes, with his speech to the rest of the chicks about his planned takeover, and the training montage that follows, which in turn is played back to back with Fred's training montage. The speech he gives to the rest of the chicks states his plans for overthrowing Mr. Bunny and taking over as the new head of Easter, claiming his title as the Easter Chick. Here, his intentions are on full display, with him being much more pronounced than before, and it's perfectly in line with his earlier attempts of him trying to gaslight Mr. Bunny into giving up the role. Him abusing his own power as second in command to get a rise out of the other chicks and verbally berating Phil for suggesting waiting for EB to come back also further highlights his superiority complex. You get a strong sense of arrogance from him with his lust for power and revenge. This is a good villain introduction. His motivations are consistent with his actions, and it's displayed in a clear enough way for the audience to observe, yet is also given an appropriate amount of screen time and isn't drawn out too much or too little. And with the friendly, sympathetic facade Carlos pulls around the other characters, it's understandable as to why the other characters would be unsuspecting around him. His intentions are clear to the audience, but not to the characters in-universe. This is what a villain should have going for them, since it actually had proper build-up from the start. The only other characters that are aware of his intentions are the other chicks, who don't really talk, and his assistant Phil, who does talk. And actually, before I get any further, I may as well take a moment to talk about Phil as well. He's Carlos' assistant throughout a majority of the film, who carries out Carlos' orders and tries to be as helpful as possible, but often ends up screwing it up. Despite the limited amount of screen time he gets compared to the other characters in the film, he does have definable traits, those being his loyalty to Carlos, his simple-minded optimism, and his love for dancing. He tries his best to follow whatever Carlos tells him, often with mixed results, but unlike Carlos, it's clear he's not doing it out of resentment for the bunnies or anything. He's actually pretty friendly towards anyone he's with, including dancing to EB playing his drum set, which, side note, is actually a good use of the Chekhov's gun trope since it's set up multiple times in the first act and uses a major part of the final battle. Phil is similar to Kronk from Emperor's New Groove, or Pinky from Pinky and the Brain in that sense. He serves the main villain and carries out whatever tasks are barked to him, but there's no way you could actually call him evil since it's clear there isn't a malicious bone in his body, and is on good terms with the rest of the cast. So, why am I just now bringing him up? Well, think about Carlos's treatment of him and how different the two are despite working towards the same goal. Whenever we see him, he's often on the receiving end of Carlos's wrath, either when he's screwing up a job or sometimes just doing nothing at all. He gets yelled at, mocked, insulted, called an idiot, and even beaten over the head for asking to touch the Egg of Destiny. Despite his mistakes, he's been nothing but loyal and friendly to Carlos, and yet he gets nothing but abuse in return, both verbal and physical. He's Carlos's most trusted assistant, and yet Carlos still thinks lesser of him, treating Phil as nothing more than just another step towards achieving his goal and taking over Easter. Phil's role in the film does give Carlos the comedic henchman that is typical for most animated villains, but in doing so, it also speaks volumes about how egotistical and sadistic Carlos really is, showing that, even with as devoted and loyal of an assistant as Phil, he still cares for nobody but himself. Next comes the two training montages for both Carlos and Fred O'Hare being played back to back, with Fred being helped by EB and Carlos being helped by Phil. This is yet another scene that I feel is misinterpreted by a lot of people who talk about this film, especially with Shape's arguments towards it. That being, since Carlos is also training hard for the role of Easter Bunny as much as Fred, that means he's equally as deserving of the role.
I mean, there was also a whole montage where he did some training for it, intercut with Carlos also doing similar training for it. They both equally wanted it, except one was actually qualified for it. So yeah, what was the difference here, Mr. EB's dad, huh?
Well, I don't know about the rest of you guys, but I spotted several big mistakes.
But how did... How?
You know what? Let's watch that montage again. Shall we? The two training montages have both Fred and Carlos training for the same role as the Easter Bunny, and while the two use slightly different methods from each other, it's still working towards the same goal. A typical training montage would start with the main character being introduced to a series of tasks and completely sucking at them first, but over time they would slowly improve and get the hang of them until they finally master it. And side note, thanks to the Mario movie doing exactly that years later, this wouldn't be the only Illumination movie to do such a thing. So how does Hop handle it? Looking at Fred first, the tasks he does in his montage are pretty straightforward. Lifting weights, leaping over hurdles while holding Easter baskets, learning to hop, and painting Easter eggs. At first it goes about as poorly as you'd expect, with Fred tripping on the hurdles and dropping the eggs or doing very crude egg paintings, but through his own determination and EB's constant words of encouragement, Fred keeps going. And as the montage goes on, you see him actually improving. He manages to get over the hurdles without dropping the eggs, and improves on his speed and agility, and gets much better on his egg painting skills. Fred is shown to improve on the things he originally messes up on, and proves himself to be capable of having such skills, building on his goal of being the Easter Bunny, and showing him to ultimately be worthy of the role. Pretty standard training montage stuff, but still ultimately works. All's well and good. Contrast this to how Carlos handles his training montage. His tasks are lifting weights, running on a track, pulling a heavy vehicle, and egg painting. He does try to do these tasks along with the help of Phil, like how Fred had EB to help with his training, but when you look at it, he doesn't succeed at any of them. Not a single one. He struggles lifting the lollipop weights even once, he trips and falls on himself during the track running, he thinks he's pulling a vehicle and really it's just Phil driving it, and he makes the egg painting all about himself.
What do you think? It's a little too hot for the kids, no?
Phil's reaction to it says it all. When Carlos does his training, he either struggles and fails at all the things he does legitimately, or just straight up cheats to make himself think he succeeded. He takes the easy route and outright refuses to improve, which is the exact opposite of how Fred did his training. When Fred failed on certain tasks, he didn't try to cheat or give up. He kept going. He improved on those tasks until he actually got good at them, and it paid off. Fred proved he was worthy by actually showing the skills he had and his determination to get better at them, and persevered until the end. Carlos, on the other hand, didn't improve. He's so egotistical and full of himself that he thinks he doesn't need to improve, when in reality, he's terrible at the things he does, and the things he does do, he cheats on. That's the difference between Fred and Carlos. Even when both are working towards the exact same goal, one actually takes the effort to improve himself and proves without a doubt that he genuinely has the skills to take on the job, and the other cheats and fails badly at what he does because he's too stubborn and self-centered to do otherwise. In the words of Crapman himself, they both equally wanted it, except one was actually qualified for it. And keep in mind, everything I've talked about Carlos so far has almost all been before the third act of the film. These are all traits and actions Carlos displayed all before he actually carried out his ultimate plan. The emotional manipulation, the gaslighting, the self-centeredness, the cheating, the lying, the abuse to his biggest supporter. It's all throughout the first and second acts of the movie. This isn't an Aristocats situation where the so-called villain did barely anything wrong before he did his plan and was only wanting what he deserved but gets shat on for it. This is someone who is actively a horrible person to the people he is around, even to the people who support him the most, and is too egotistical and self-absorbed to give two shits about anyone that isn't himself. Even his ultimate plan isn't to make the rest of the chicks rise up to give them better lives than they would have. It's about making himself powerful, and having himself and only himself rule over Easter. Just because a villain doesn't do overly villainous things before the third act, it doesn't make them not a villain. It's like saying Ursula from The Little Mermaid wasn't a villain until the third act because she didn't try to murder anybody until then, and was more deserving to win because Ariel was a little whiny. Never mind that she actively manipulates Ariel into giving up her voice, traps people in her cave just for not following her orders, and blatantly plans on overthrowing King Triton and ruling the whole ocean. She didn't initially murder anybody, so that automatically means she didn't do anything wrong. If the traits are there from the start, then it should be enough to convey to the audience that they shouldn't trust them, and ignoring these traits does nothing but remove context. Villains can be villains without immediately doing overly villainous things, and Carlos is perfect proof of this. Now, we come to the third and final act of the movie. It starts off when EB tries to escape, but goes back to save Fred when he realizes just how much danger he's in, which I've already went over in the first section, so I'll leave it at that. Meanwhile at Easter Island, Fred wakes up to find himself tied up and being framed for EB's supposed death, and Carlos tries to use this opportunity to announce EB is dead and manipulate Mr. Bunny further.
EB was like your son to me. I'm trying to keep it together, but don't you worry, I will take care of Easter.
Whoa. Does anyone care that that's a butterball turkey?
No, that is EB. He has the same chart and everything. My deepest condolences.
Carlos starts enacting his plan by locking all the other bunnies in a single room, stampeding Mr. Bunny, and stealing the Egg of Destiny staff by force. He ties Fred and Mr. Bunny to a machine over a vat of boiling liquid, threatening to boil them both alive as he claims the title of Easter's new king. Oh yeah, and there's that scene of him beating Phil over the head for wanting to touch the staff.
Ow! There, he touched it.
What a trustworthy guy. I have split feelings about the way this final climax starts. On the one hand, yeah, I do admittedly agree that the bit about Carlos replacing the candy and chocolate with dried crickets and worms does feel really shoehorned in, and it's the one part that feels too cartoonishly evil for this character, whether you already saw him as a villain or not. This part in the plan was never alluded to before, and he never seemed to have any problem with the candy itself, so I don't know why he's suddenly calling for all the candy to be replaced with crickets and worms in the final act. Maybe it's an act of pettiness, but from what we've seen of him, it just doesn't fit. However, what does fit for Carlos is him enthusiastically trying to murder both Mr. Bunny and Fred, since one is a person he's already despised and planned to get rid of since the beginning, and the other has already seen too much and would only be seen as an obstacle. The Carlos we've seen up to this point is nothing short of a power-hungry sociopath who shows no concern with EB possibly being dead and even shows excitement for it. So I honestly do believe he would go the extra mile as to get rid of his foes in such a sadistic way once he got the chance. In fact, this entire final climax is just Carlos' sadism displayed on full force. Not only is he completely drunk on power and revenge, but he tries to have Mr. Bunny and Fred boiled alive, immobilizes and puts EB through a buzzsaw machine, which thankfully he survives, and painfully beats down EB in a fight like a wrestling match, all with a cruel smile on his face. This is someone who is so much of a cruel sociopath and is so hell-bent on revenge that it ultimately consumes him, turning him from someone who is already bitter and angry into a sadistic monster. Even his transformation scene, while visually horrifying, seems to be reminiscent of this. His greed and forcefulness in taking over has turned him into a terrifying figure, one that he may never come back from. It makes thematic sense for the villain both plot-wise and character-wise with how it was built up, and is paid off in a way that makes him an effective threat for EB to overcome in the end. All of this combined is why I think Carlos is an excellent villain, and one of the biggest highlights about the film. Carlos has a clear and consistent motivation, and the character traits that the movie focuses on make sense for the character. You know how manipulative and egotistical he is, yet he still keeps up a good enough performance to be entertaining. It supports the story, it's consistent from beginning to end, mostly, it has enough villainous moments and traits to justify his role in the story, and it has a good amount of focus for him to be built upon while not taking away from the main plotline. This is all the marks of a good villain. Alright now, I think I've gotten as much analysis out of the characters as I could possibly get. I definitely had more fun analyzing the characters from this movie than I would have done out of something like Grinch or Lorax, and it's certainly more than most people could say out of the characters from Secret Life of Pets or something. Now let's talk about the music. Now, since this movie is about a rabbit who's obsessed with drumming, it only makes sense that the movie he stars in would have its music play a significant role. It doesn't have enough to be a straight-up musical like how the Sing movies were, but the music in Hop does play an important part in the movie regardless. The music in this movie can basically be broken into two sections, licensed music and background music. The background music I don't really have much to say on since it's really just average and gets the job done just fine, but I'd say it's the licensed music that really shines in this movie. The licensed music is mostly used either to set the tone of a scene, or in some specific cases, become defining moments in the film's story. In Hop, there's a total of 15 licensed songs, a few of which are done by artists that were popular at the time, but most actually date back as far as the 1970s or 1990s. Some, like Casey and the Sunshine Band's Boogie Shoes or Good Charlotte's The Anthem, are simply used to establish a character's personality without outright explaining it. For example, EB and Phil are both people who like music. Specifically, EB is someone who loves drumming, and Phil is someone who loves dancing, so it makes thematic sense that they would both listen to catchy songs that would provoke both of these actions. I already went over how drumming is a major part of EB's personality, and Phil is often seen with a pair of headphones on and dancing to music while he's working. It's part of their characters, so the catchy songs make sense to be there. I won't go over every single one of these songs since that would take longer than it should, but what I will go over are the ones that I feel that are most relevant to the film's plot, those being Higher Ground, Dynamite, and of course, I Want Candy. First up is Higher Ground. It appears during the scene when EB is first trying to escape from the Pink Berets during what happens to be Fred's job interview at a video game company. He overhears the Blind Boys of Alabama themselves practicing with playing their instruments, and when he hears that they need a drummer because their own went out for coffee, EB jumps at the chance. He gets up to the drum set, and they proceed to play. What makes this scene good is the fact that it's the first time when we get to see EB put his drumming skills in action. Yes, we did get him showing off his drumming in the opening scene, but that was him in his own room with only Phil as an audience, and that was there to first establish EB's abilities as a drummer. Here, it's showing EB's first experience with a real band, which is what EB has openly expressed he's wanted to do, and it serves as a small glimpse as to the future that EB is working towards in the first act. He gets a taste of what it's like to drum in an actual band, even if it's just for a little bit, and gives him first-hand experience that clearly sticks with him. I'd also argue this makes his turnaround in the third act all the more satisfying, because he knows what he's giving up in going after Fred, yet does so anyway. Giving the main character first-hand experience of the dream he's originally working towards, so that he actually knows what it's like, rather than just having it be described to the audience, is an excellent move. It's a good way of building upon his character in a way that comes back later in the story without it being directly referenced. Thematically, it works. As for the song choice itself, not only is it catchy on its own, but it's a good choice to have it be one with a good drum beat behind it without overshadowing the actual song. You can hear EB's drumming just fine, and it is enough to show his skill at it, but it's not too distracting to where it overwhelms the rest of the song, instead working hand in hand with it. The focus on the scene isn't purely the drumming itself, but more so EB getting to have the experience of drumming with other people. Not to mention it is a popular song that most people in the general public would know, but it's also not too recent so that it would otherwise feel like it's just using a trendy song for the sake of using a trendy song. I'm not saying that simply using more recent songs is inherently bad. They can work if done correctly, which we'll actually get to in just a little bit, but if you're going to have pre-made licensed songs in an animated movie, having more classic songs in the soundtrack is a good way to balance the song choices out and give it more diversity, and I think Higher Ground was a good choice in doing exactly that. Next up on the song list is during the scene where EB auditions for Hoff's Got Talent. Mr. David's SpongeBob movie Hasselhoff is watching audition after audition, going through failed attempt after failed attempt. Fred presents EB to Hasselhoff, the lights go dim, and EB starts to play the drums to Tom Cruise's Dynamite.
I came to... This sucks.
This scene is basically what I meant when I said earlier that simply using a trendy song in your animated movie isn't inherently a bad thing as long as it actually works. Sure, there have absolutely been examples of animated movies having songs in them that don't work since they're inappropriate and or don't match with the scene it's in, like with, say, Shrek the Third.
Live and let die.
How did anyone think this was a good idea? But in my eyes, this scene isn't one of them. This scene does have significance in the plot, since it's the audition that ultimately decides if EB's efforts for getting famous were worth it or not, so having a fitting song choice for it is crucial for making this scene work. It would have to be a song that would have EB's drumming skills stand out, while also not clashing with the song itself. And I'm not sure how much of a hot take this is, but I actually think Dynamite was among some of the perfect song choices for this scene. This isn't only because it's a catchy and recognizable song, though that does contribute to it, but also because it accomplished its goal in the scene perfectly. It already has a good rhythm to it, so it's easy to follow and drum to, but it also leaves a lot of room to add more to it. The song itself puts a lot more focus on its melody than it does on the basic drum beat, which means anyone can drum along to it and put their own spin on it while still keeping the melody recognizable. That's what this scene is about. Unlike the last song where the focus was EB's experience of being in a band rather than the drumming itself, this scene is all about EB's drumming. He got this far, and it's his ultimate chance to showcase what he's capable of, so the drumming is entirely the focus of this scene. It just needed a good melody to accompany it. Like I said way back with how EB's drumming animation was made to be accurate, this was another intentional move by the filmmakers. They wanted to include songs that, while recognizable, would also be good songs that made sense to drum to. In the director Tim Hill's own words, "We definitely looked for both popular music and stuff that was drummable, or if it wasn't, we would make our own drum track. For example, that Tom Cruise song, when you listen to it without the drum, there's not really that much there. But we took it. It was the intention from the start to have recognizable songs in the movie because of how drummable they were. It's not a situation where the songs were chosen just because they were popular at the time and nothing else. This was a song that was deliberately chosen to fit within the movie itself. And I think it works incredibly well. It keeps the focus entirely on highlighting EB's drumming, which is what the scene intends to do, while also being a catchy song on its own merit. While it is among the more recent songs on this list, it's a popular song that actually had a real narrative purpose for being there in the first place, and it works. That is the type of goal that a film using a pre-made popular song should strive to do. Because if the song isn't relevant to the movie or doesn't serve any purpose other than it being popular, why have it at all? And last but not least, the setup for the next song is that Fred is attending his younger sister Alex's Easter play, with EB hidden in a satchel. He sees some bunny-shaped shadows approaching and thinks they're the Pink Berets, to which he runs away in fear, but it turns out they were just kids in bunny costumes. With Fred and EB now awkwardly being on stage having disrupted the play, and Fred's father questioning how the rabbit just talked, they need to find a way out of this mess and fast. EB does some quick thinking and pretends that Fred's a ventriloquist, they get the audience entertained, and EB decides to use his musical skills once more by performing what is arguably this movie's signature song, I Want Candy. Now, I'm putting this in with the licensed songs despite the film having its own version of it, since the original version of the song actually dates all the way back to 1965, originally written and recorded by the American garage rock band The Strangeloves. This song has gotten many different covers and versions throughout the years, all from tons of different artists, with the version in the Hop soundtrack being specifically covered by Cody Simpson. It's a song that has gotten enough popularity to have had as many different iterations as it did, and like with Higher Ground, it's a great example of a song that has enough popularity to justify its existence, while also not being a recent song that feels like it was put in just because it was popular. And it's a thematically appropriate song as well. On its own, it's really fun, upbeat, and easy to dance to, which fits the tone of the movie and is what the soundtrack was intended to be overall. Not to mention, it fits perfectly with EB as a fun-loving, upbeat character. It seems exactly like the type of song EB would sing, both for the obvious candy/Easter connection and because of the fun, loving, upbeat nature of the song itself as well. I understand if others don't like it, but personally, I love it. Along with it just being a fun song in general, it's also a song that has the most influence on the film's story. The last two were like this as well, albeit on a lesser scale, since those were more meant to build up and flesh out EB's character as the film went on. Higher Ground showed EB getting a taste of his dream so that it would be more powerful for him to reject it later, and Dynamite was meant to showcase his skills as a drummer and prove his worth. These scenes both had significance, but those also focused solely on EB. One character that didn't get that same sort of treatment up to this point, however, is Fred. The one who's been accompanying EB through practically the entire journey, and who, up to this point, has been pressured from his family to find a suitable job and make something of himself. This is Fred's story as much as it is EB's, and having a song that serves as much plot significance to his story as the last two songs had with EB would be the perfect move for him right about now. That's where I Want Candy comes in. This song is set up where both Fred and EB are in the same situation, yet here, Fred is essentially the main focus. He's the entire reason they're here, since it's his younger sister's play, and by this point, he's already helped EB with the biggest steps in achieving his dream, and bonded with him over their respective overbearing fathers. His backstory in the beginning was what sparked his love for Easter, and this song emphasizes that with helping him realize his calling of wanting to be the Easter Bunny. It's a fun and upbeat song that fits the Easter spirit, and it's one where Fred has genuine fun singing it with EB and entertaining the crowd. It's the catalyst that gets Fred to realize who and what he truly wants to be, since the song fits right in with his love for Easter and he realizes how much fun he had getting into it. It also ties directly into Fred's storyline in the film as well, since his whole motivation in the film is that he's pushed into finding a job so that he can make something of himself despite Fred's lack of motivation for it. And this song adds to that by giving Fred an actual motivation and purpose for who he feels like he should be. That is, being the Easter Bunny. For once in his life, he felt like he actually found something that fit with who he was, actually showing growth from who he was before. EB was the spark that started it, but I Want Candy was the one that pushed it further. It's a song that has thematic purpose, ties into the character's storylines, and is a good song on its own merit. That is what a good usage of a licensed song should be. Now, since I've also mentioned Minions before in this video, I bet you're wondering why I've been neglecting to mention it for a while. How does the music in that compare? Well...
Oh, god damn. How do I turn this shit off? How do I turn this shit off? Sweet release. No!
Let's not talk about it. Alright, this section's probably going to be a lot shorter than the other ones. Before I get to my biggest and final point, I want to address a few miscellaneous complaints from Schaefrellis' review, mainly because I wanted to talk about them, but I couldn't find a way to fit these into any other category. Think of this as an honorable mentions of some sorts. Or maybe dishonorable mentions, whatever.
He trashes the mansion that belongs to James Marsden's sister's boss, who is a character we never see, so I don't even know why this is a plot point. The boss who owns the mansion isn't in the movie, so it doesn't matter that they wrecked his house.
Fred and his sister worrying about the mansion getting trashed absolutely matters in the story. Even if the boss themselves isn't seen, it's still connected to the main characters, since Fred's sister Sam works for said boss. After Fred is kicked out of his house, Sam sees that Fred needs a place to live and responsibilities to uphold, so she entrusts him with taking care of the mansion while the boss who owns it is on vacation. If the mansion is wrecked, not only does Sam get in major trouble and potentially fired, but it would further prove that Fred is incapable of being a successful independent adult, which is the entire purpose of Fred's story arc in the movie. Not to mention Fred would also have no place to live since his parents kicked him out. Granted, my points about EB from earlier still stand, since EB doesn't know about this at all when he trashes the room, so what he did wasn't malicious in any way, he was still just being an immature teen, but the effects would still stand. What would the boss being physically seen or not change about this?
Uh-oh, James Marsden needs to make sure nobody knows the bunny can talk, and he's constantly gotta hide him. But then they just go to a diner and the bunny talks to the waiter and she doesn't care that he's a talking bunny. So does it matter if people know the bunny can talk or not? Because it doesn't seem to matter at all.
That straight up does not happen. Yes, there are attempts to hide EB from the public due to him being a talking bunny, but one, this doesn't happen until after the diner scene, not before. In fact, the entire purpose of the diner scene was meant for Fred and EB to have a moment to each other to talk about their plans and what steps they would take to accomplish them, which already is a common trope in most pieces of media, especially ones with a diner setting, and EB having to hide himself talking was one of these steps. The way Shay frames it makes it seem like the film is explaining the need for the bunny to hide after the attempts are already made, which would have made no sense for the flow of the film, when in reality it's the other way around. You can't switch the order of certain scenes around and then criticize the film for it not making sense when it was your own doing. And two, even if one person didn't care that a bunny could talk, that doesn't automatically mean that every other person wouldn't care either, as immediately shown with Fred's father reacting to EB talking at the Easter play. So attempting to hide EB's talking still thematically makes sense. As for the diner waitress in particular, the whole joke with her is that she's what TV Tropes calls a world-weary waitress, a sarcastic waitress who has pretty much seen everything by this point and doesn't do so much as bat an eye at any weirder activities, instead just treating it as another regular occurrence in her dead-end job. A good example of this outside of Hop is the one from Emperor's New Groove, where the waitress doesn't react to the giant talking llama in front of her and instead treats it like an everyday occurrence. Yes, it would have been weird to have pretty much anyone else not react to EB talking, except for one moment which we'll get to in a little bit, but having the burnt-out sarcastic waitress be totally unfazed by the talking rabbit in front of her works as a comedic moment, and it was chosen for that specific reason.
The girl gets mad at James Marsden for embarrassing her in front of everyone at the pageant, but then that's forgotten about entirely and seems resolved by the end.
Alright, this is a point I half agree with. Yes, I will admit the lack of acknowledgement on Fred's younger sister being upset is really strange, and it would have been much better for Fred's younger sister to acknowledge or bring up the play at least sometime after that scene was over, like for example having Fred apologizing to her. It felt like something the writers just kind of forgot about when making it. However, her getting mad at Fred was a really small moment, only lasting like 3 seconds of screen time and not really focused on all that much in the scene itself. It's also worth remembering that at the start of Fred's story in the movie, she was among the rest of Fred's family members in wanting to kick him out, with them all having their own pre-written speeches. She was entirely with the family's idea of forcing Fred to get a job, so it stands to reason that the next time we see her after the play scene is near the end, when Fred actually has his job of being co-Easter Bunny, and by then she seems to have gotten over her animosity towards Fred. So personally, I just chalk this up to her having forgiven Fred off-screen. Maybe that's just me making excuses for this part, because it is a valid criticism for the most part and could have been easily fixed, but it's not really something that bothers me all that much. Also, come on, she was like 12 when this movie came out.
EB goes to audition for David Hasselhoff's talent competition. And yes, this is a major plot point and the bunny's entire plan for getting famous. And he asks David Hasselhoff,
"You're not surprised that I'm a talking rabbit?"
And he says,
"My best friend's a talking car."
Get it? It's a reference to a TV show that aired from 1982 to 1986. One that children in the year 2011, when this movie came out, would have intimate knowledge of. Did nobody on the set of Knight Rider tell David Hasselhoff that this show wasn't real?
Okay, I'm sorry, this one just makes absolutely no sense. Hasselhoff making a reference to his past work in Knight Rider was clearly a joke towards himself. Nothing about the sentence implied he thought the show was real. Actors referencing their past shows or films that they previously starred in isn't an uncommon thing to happen, and this just so happens to be one of them, and Hasselhoff being unfazed by the rabbit talking in front of him adds on to that joke. I'm not going to say it's 100% fleshed out, but it's a perfectly fine joke for what it is, with it being a simple punchline and a tongue-in-cheek reference to one of Hasselhoff's most well-known works. It's really not all that deep. And as for the point about the show being old so kids wouldn't get the Knight Rider reference, do you not get how pop culture works? Most of the stuff you see from pop culture history, be it movies, video games, or TV shows, comes from eras that most people our age were more than likely not even close to being born in, and yet a good majority of them still have just as much significance and cultural impact nowadays as they did when they first came out. Why do you think people still recognize, rewatch, and even parody things such as I Love Lucy or Gilligan's Island, despite them being decades old? Hell, I was born in the early 2000s and I was still watching Andy Griffith reruns and Speed Racer re-releases at 6 years old. Just because something is significantly old does not mean that kids in modern times won't ever see them or recognize them. This applies to Knight Rider as well. It's well known to the point of it being referenced and parodied countless times by other pieces of media, appearing in movies, shows, commercials, and even getting its own set in LEGO Dimensions of all things. And yeah, I get that there is absolutely such a thing as animated movies making pop culture references that kids are unlikely to get.
Are you not entertained?
But with this one, it's really not even that bad of a joke. You don't have to be a fan of the show to understand who or what Kit is, or even what the basic premise of the show is. I haven't watched a single episode of Knight Rider and I still understood what the joke was. Hasselhoff mentioning his friend being a talking car is not a reference that requires quote-unquote intricate knowledge of the show to understand. It's just the premise of the show, and it's as basic of a reference as you can get. This point is so dumb it makes my head hurt. Alright, I think that's it for specific complaints I wanted to get out. Again, just to be clear, I have no beef with Schaeferless as a person, and I still love watching his content. I just had issues with this review in particular and wanted to voice my criticisms about it. Just because I don't like one review of his does not mean I hate him or his content as a whole. Just want to clarify that. Got it? Alright, good. With that aside, I think now is a good time to move into my final point for the film, and trust me, this one is a doozy. Hop is an Easter movie. I know, how shocking. When it comes to holiday movies, there are lots of different types out there, covering many different holidays in a variety of genres, with arguably the two biggest holiday categories being Christmas and Halloween. There have been comedy films, horror films, romance films, fantasies, sci-fi, murder mystery, whatever type of genre is out there, at least one holiday film or TV show episode has been centered around it. But despite this plethora of different holiday films, they each seem to have a basic common goal, making the viewer feel good about the holiday being presented, especially when they're watching the film around that holiday. For Hop, this holiday happens to be Easter, one holiday that, despite it being well known, surprisingly doesn't have a whole lot of movies about it. I mean, think about it, what other options are out there? Peter Rabbit? The Dog Who Saved Easter? Peter Rabbit 2? Hop's basic goal is simple. It's meant to be a film that, while also having a good story to tell in its own merit, as we covered earlier, it serves as an enjoyable movie to watch during the Easter holiday, which also means representing the holiday in a meaningful way. It's a simple goal for sure, but that doesn't necessarily make it bad. A lot of goals for making projects are simple like that, especially when it comes to making movies. But how does it go about achieving that goal? How does Hop represent Easter as a holiday in a way that actually means something? Well, I'd say the best way to do this is break it into two groups: how the movie uses the holiday visually, and how it's integrated into the story itself. First, let's talk about how the movie looks. A lot of the ways Hop uses its Easter imagery is about what you'd expect from your typical holiday movie, with its use of symbolism like eggs and candy and that sort of stuff, especially during the Easter play. It's enough to make it clear that this does take place during the Easter holidays, and there is an emphasis on it, but thankfully not too much to where it's shoved down your throat. Most of the scenes that take place in the human world are kind of downplayed in this regard, since it's mainly just our regular world, but it's shot decently enough and visually looks fine. And again, it is impressive just how well E.B.'s bunny design blends into the human world, as we've mentioned before. But honestly, I'd say where the Easter symbolism especially shines are the scenes having to do with the Easter factory, which are about as frequent in the movie as the human world scenes are. The Easter factory is established in this movie as where all the Easter candy is made. You know, Peeps, Cadbury eggs, chocolate bunnies, that sort of thing. And I gotta say, even today, this looks fantastic. If I had to describe it, I'd say it feels like a more Easter-themed version of Santa's Workshop combined with Willy Wonka's Chocolate Factory. It's colorful and whimsical in all the right ways, and the impressive scale really makes it feel massive. It's pretty much designed like how you would expect a child to imagine how a candy factory works, and I mean that as a good thing. Right away it catches your attention and gives itself that whimsical feel most associated with holiday films, while also establishing a major location for our main characters. Adding on to this, and going back to the beginning of the film, the opening scenes in general do a good job of setting the holiday movie tone that the film is going for. Both in and outside the factory, the colors are bright and appealing, which matches the childlike wonder that young E.B. goes through upon seeing the inside of the factory. In contrast, the brief scene we see of young Fred catching a glimpse of the Easter Bunny at nighttime is shot with darker, bluer colors, matching the mysteriousness that comes with seeing a holiday icon. In both these cases for the opening of the film, the colors help in setting the lighthearted and magical tones that a holiday film should have going for itself, and I'd even argue that it helps the later scenes right after of E.B. and Fred more grown up. It's a drastic change in tone that helps to show how much these characters have changed since the opening, going from a magical holiday tone to a more grounded and cynical, yet still mostly upbeat tone. The visuals do the job of setting up the film's tones and supports the feeling of it being a holiday movie. Visuals aren't everything though. There needs to be a lot more to a good holiday film than just how it looks. It needs to have substance behind it, a reason for centering around this holiday and telling its story in the first place. So this brings me to my final point for this movie: how it integrates Easter into the story. For a holiday movie to work, it not only has to have its plot be tied directly to the holiday in question, but it should also tell a story in a cohesive manner that makes the holiday clear while also making the story work on its own merits. I've already technically gone over how Hop works as a movie on its own, so I'll leave it at that, but as for how it uses Easter to tell its story is another topic entirely. One way that Easter is worked into the story is that it's used as a specific period of time. Excluding the bit at the beginning with young Evie and Fred, the plot of the film starts 2 weeks before Easter and ultimately ends on Easter morning. It's relevant to both our main characters, since Evie has to take on the responsibility of being crowned Easter Bunny before Easter starts, and Fred makes a vow to his family that he'll have gotten his act together and found a steady job by Easter.
In a couple of months, couple of weeks, you're gonna see a whole new Fred. Yeah, by Easter. Easter's in 2 weeks. By Easter, I'm gonna have a new job, I'm gonna have a new place, a new life.
While this type of plot structure definitely isn't unique to Hop, it is generally a good way of giving both characters a set goal and having a deadline to achieving it. And aside from being a decent plot structure, it also works the holiday into being an integral part of the characters' stories. Fred initially just uses it as a deadline motivation for getting his act together as his family wanted, which is all well and good, but it becomes all the more relevant later in the film when he gets inspired to be the Easter Bunny. With him already being in pursuit of finding a fulfilling job, the added goal of Fred wanting to be the Easter Bunny gives Fred the motivation he's needed, adding more stakes to his end goal. Suddenly, he's on the clock to learn the skills on how to be the Easter Bunny, with Easter coming up so quickly, and it's fueled even further by the interest for Easter that he's had ever since that first night in the opening, where he catches sight of the actual Easter Bunny, and his reaction later on to when he first learns Evie is meant to be the Easter Bunny. It builds off of what he was already shown to have a personal connection to, and ties the holiday to his storyline in a consistent way. As for EB's case, the way Easter is worked into his story is arguably a lot more elaborate. The basics of it is that he doesn't want to be what his father expects and forces him to be, so he runs away from home to pursue his own career, but ends up befriending someone who he relates to, and they ultimately help each other learn their own senses of responsibility. It's a decent plot structure, but how exactly does Easter fit into all this? Well, more than you might think. Easter has been a major part of EB's entire life ever since he was little, from the island he lives on to the Easter factory to even his bedroom having various Easter eggs in it. He's been raised from the ground up to be next in line for carrying on the role of the Easter Bunny, one of the most well-known holiday icons next to Santa Claus, and one that's meant to bring joy to millions of children around the world. It's a huge responsibility, but it's not one that EB is passionate about, at least not in his later years. When EB was a child, he was amazed and awestruck at how magical the Easter factory looked, and how he would one day pick up the mantle of being one of the most important holiday icons in the world. He was looking forward to it. But as time went on, the stress and fatigue of his father constantly trying to make EB into the perfect Easter Bunny has caused the magic to wane significantly. It's been turned from something that, what was once a source of wonder and amazement to EB, has now become a chore that he feels doesn't define who he actually is, and as such has become disillusioned by it.
Look, Dad, ever since I was yay big, it's been the Easter Bunny wouldn't do that, and the Easter Bunny has to be perfect, but I'm not perfect.
I know that, son, but you'll get there eventually.
But it's when EB crosses paths with Fred, and the two slowly manage to connect on a personal level, that everything starts to change. It's established how Fred has an interest in Easter and the determination to be the Easter Bunny, but fundamentally lacks the skills for it, whereas EB is the exact opposite. He isn't interested in the position itself, but he does have the skills and knowledge about being the Easter Bunny pretty much back to front. This is where EB finally gets to use his knowledge of Easter in a practical way, and it's this knowledge that helps both further their friendship with each other. Easter is a fundamental part of who EB is, even if it's not in the traditional style that was expected by his father, and EB uses it to both his and Fred's advantage. Not to mention, it also starts EB on fully realizing his own responsibilities, both to his friends and family, and also to his role as the Easter Bunny. He knows how important Easter is to Fred, and while he initially has his own goal in mind when agreeing to help, he bonds with Fred over it and genuinely supports him the whole way through. This is a major part of what makes EB realize both his responsibility to those he cares about and taking on the role of the job that involves Easter, because he realizes the degrees that he is capable of going through to help others, and how it not only makes him happy, but others happy as well. It's spreading joy to others, like what the Easter Bunny and what Easter as a whole stands for. And it makes his proclamation at the end of him being ready to accept the role make his storyline come full circle. It completes his own story, and connects to the holiday that the film centers around. In total, Hop manages to have its own holiday be relevant to the plot, support its characters, and come around full circle in a way that makes narrative sense. It's pretty much why I love revisiting it so often, both as a movie on its own to casually watch, and as a nice holiday film to come back to whenever Easter rolls around. Whether visually or narratively, Hop is a good holiday movie. And that was my defense of Hop 2011, possibly the most overhated movie in Illumination's catalog. Of course, it's not the greatest one either, especially not compared to Despicable Me or the Mario movie, like, come on. But I still greatly enjoy Hop for what it is, and I find myself coming back to it multiple times, either to enjoy watching it around the Easter holidays, or just as a nice casual movie on its own. Despite its flaws, I still can't help myself but genuinely have a good time every time I watch it, and now I hope I've been fully able to express why. Compared to some of the other films that Illumination has put out over the years, from corporate pandering schlock that misses the point of its source material, to bland generic movies that leave your brain the moment you stop watching them, to actual abominations of mankind, I would consider Hop to be a nice breath of fresh air amongst that lineup. I do have hope that Illumination is able to step up their game more in the coming years, considering the success of the Mario movie and how Migration genuinely does look promising, and if they do, that would be great. But even with that aside, I'll always have a fondness for this movie in particular, which is enough for me to say that Hop 2011 is not the worst Illumination movie. Thank you, and good night.